All right, everyone. I think we have a good number of folks on the call now. I'd like to get started. Welcome to the December call. As I mentioned, this is Rochelle Haddock, the University of Calgary. My co-pilot, Caroline Savage, is not able to join us today. Her grandfather is having a 90th birthday party that she's attending, so hopefully I can keep this webinar flying, so to speak. And we're really pleased to have a case study to share with you today. Peter Buckland will be talking about the efficacy of campuses lab projects. So we have a very simple agenda today, a couple minutes up front to talk about any announcements that individuals have to share. We'll have lots of time to dig into our case study. As I mentioned, Peter has graciously agreed to share with us, and hopefully a good amount of time to engage in some discussion about what Peter has shared with us and how it's relevant to each of our work. Now, before passing the baton to Peter, I'm curious if anyone has any announcements they would like to share. Feel free to type in the chat box and I can unmute you so you can speak to the group. Okay, hearing and seeing none, I'll take this opportunity to pass the baton over to Peter. And Peter Buckland is the Academic Programs Manager at Penn State Sustainability Institute. He's an affiliate faculty in educational theory and policy. I don't have a formal bio to read for Peter, but I'm hopeful he can provide you with a bit more background on his role and his background. I'm going to now unmute Peter and provide screen sharing to him. One moment while I do that. Peter. Okay, and this is my first time doing this, which is why I'm talking through all the steps here.
Okay. That is A-okay.
Here we go, Peter. You should be able to take over the controls now.
All right, here. And can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, looks good. All right. So first of all, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to sharing. So yeah, I am the Academic Programs Manager at Penn State's Sustainability Institute. I'm affiliate faculty in educational theory and policy, and I do a few different things. I teach courses in sustainability and leadership. I teach in the College of Education. Primarily what I do is I work with faculty and staff across the university to integrate sustainability into the curriculum of the university and into the co-curriculum of the university. So that means that I get to work with earth scientists, philosophers, artists, all sorts of people all over the university to bring sustainability into the classroom, as well as into the outreach components. So I do things like work on film series. I'm working with our Palmer Museum of Art right now on an initiative called the Plastic Entanglements. So I get to do a lot of really fun, really exciting, very creative things. I was hired at Penn State Sustainability Institute in 2014 to assess the Reinvention Fund, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So what I'll do is I'll just say a bit about Penn State and sustainability. Then I'll dive into the Reinvention Fund and spend a fair amount on numbers 3 and number 4, evaluating and investigating the Reinvention Fund, and then the findings and the takeaways from it. And then I will be very happy to take your questions. And as I write here at the end, I hope that you walk away with a sense of how we envision living labs some ideas perhaps about assessing them and some methods, and then what constitutes a successful living lab for sustainability. Of course, this is always a learning process, and there is plenty that I don't know, and I'm really eager to learn from all of you. So Penn State started as the Pennsylvania Farmers College, and before that was the Farmers High School in the 19th century, but formally became a land-grant university with the passage of the Morrill Act in 1862, signed into law by Abraham Lincoln, who you can see on the left part of your screen there. That is a fresco in our old main building. When you walk in, you see Abraham Lincoln standing there with a young farmer who is coming to Penn State to learn the agricultural and engineering professions. In the 155 years since the Morrill Act was passed, Penn State has become a comprehensive Research One university. We have about 93,000 students at 23 campuses and a world campus. We have an operating budget of somewhere around $5.5 billion. So it is, it has a budget that is larger than 40 countries. But at its heart, it is a land grant institution that must serve the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and it has a long history of stewardship and fights for equality. So something in the DNA has existed for sustainability for quite some time, as well as applied sciences. So the Sustainability Institute came about following a sustainability strategic plan, and what we did, what happened in the creation of that plan was our defining sustainability. So sustainability is the simultaneous pursuit of human health and happiness, environmental quality, and economic well-being for current and future generations. And that comes from the Sustainability Strategic Plan. And that's a, sort of typical UN Brundtland definition plus the triple bottom line. But it does include happiness, which makes me personally very happy. But what else came out of this Sustainability Strategic Plan was a commitment to realizing sustainability through the living lab. And like many, folks wondered, well, what does that really mean? So faculty and staff from the Sustainability Institute began really looking at this, and Dr. David Riley, who's an architectural engineering professor, Lisa Brown, who was on the staff previously at the Center for Sustainability and then the Sustainability Institute, and Dr. Denise Wardrop, who was the first director of the Sustainability Institute, came to this, and largely because of Dr. Riley's attendance to some workshops that were shared with Portland State and some other universities in 2013. So I'll go ahead and read this, because this is sort of what ended up guiding as an idea what came to be at Penn State. A living laboratory is an ecosystem for learning that enables the unique features of our communities, facilities, campus grounds, and regional neighborhoods to serve as test beds for the development of innovative solutions to real challenges. Through project-based teaching, research, and applied work, we will combine our talents across the functions of the university and within our community to explore, experiment, and evaluate actionable solutions. So you may hear or see in that definition ideas like campuses lab, engaged learning, applied learning, solutions learning. So it really was a fairly expansive vision of the living lab that wasn't limited to the campus alone. It is really very broad. So what happened is that Dr. Riley, Dr. Wardrop, and some others decided that we needed to create a fund for doing this, and that became the Reinvention Fund. Many of the materials that I may reference are available on the Sustainability Institute's website, sustainability.psu.edu/reinvention. That is included later, and I will make these slides available with a lot of notes that are included. So if you don't get everything, don't worry, it will be embedded in a document that will be made available to you. So the Reinvention Fund was invested $876,000 in 33 projects that took place all over, well, not all over the world, but in many, many places. There were projects that occurred in 16 counties at about a dozen of the Commonwealth campuses plus University Park. Projects also traveled to Amherst, Massachusetts, to New York, to Philadelphia, to Las Vegas, and 2 of them were focused in Africa, in Sierra Leone and in South Africa. Funding for individual projects ranged from $550 for the establishment of a food pantry for students who face hunger to $75,000 in some of the much larger projects that occurred with our Office of Physical Plant and at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. And there is a lot of gradation in between. We had students from about 40 different academic programs, faculty from about 35 different disciplines, staff from approximately the same number of different units within the university, a lot of different student clubs, and they interacted with something like 80 to 100 NGOs, government organizations, businesses, etc. It was really very far-reaching and multi-scalar. Now, you can imagine that when I was hired to assess this thing, I thought, wow, that's an absolutely gigantic number of things and people to talk to and possibly events to go to, and what is it exactly that you want me to understand? My PhD work, I did qualitative research and case studies on sustainability education, so I had some idea of how to go about doing this, but it was really a rather daunting task. And what Denise Wardrop asked me to do was to determine the capital returns for all stakeholders in the Reinvention Fund. And so I went about formulating a set of questions and a conceptual framework and my methods and validity checks using Maxwell's Qualitative Research Design 2nd edition. It's an absolutely fantastic resource. I use it with some of my more advanced undergraduate students, and I use it with graduate students who I've worked with. And if you are interested in creating a good program evaluation where you're going to be using a lot of qualitative methods and data, I really suggest using it. So I was given these project goals and formulated the research questions that you can see there by really thinking about what the Reinvention Fund was trying to do. And if we think about sustainability and you think about triple bottom lines, you quickly understand that translating returns into money ends up missing a great deal of what you're trying to do, and that so much of what we wanted our living labs to do, and what many of you probably are looking for, are metrics or stories that show other forms of capital, human capital, like deep learning, for example, the development of skills, social capital, so bonding among people who have already worked together and bridging the development of new networks. Produced capital, whether that be some sort of online, like a website or an app, or actual physical built infrastructure like a photovoltaic array or a change to a stormwater system. Of course, financial capital, money, and natural capital, were any ecosystem services bolstered over the course of these projects and perhaps beyond. So that was one part of what we were looking to understand, and probably the things that could be most meaningful. We also wanted to know what we could learn about the Living Lab concept through assessing these projects. And then finally, what made a successful project. So I went about conducting over 70 interviews, analyzing, I don't have an exact number of the documents that I analyzed, well over 100 for sure. I also participated in some of the projects and also got a lot of self-reporting from the groups themselves. And then I was able to more or less do some validity and reliability checks by following up with people who I had interviewed and cross-checking among my many different sources. So in determining what the capital was, and I already went through the human, social, produced, financial, and natural capital, we also wanted to see how those returns could have gone to different stakeholders. So this diagram comes from Carol Sanford's Responsible Business. And so we wanted to know how customers, those people who were served by the Reinvention Fund, how they may have been affected. The co-creators, so the people who created the projects and implemented them and were deeply involved. Also Earth, that almost goes without saying, considering that we were looking at natural capital. Also the community, the communities, whether that is a campus community or some broader community, whether in Sierra Leone or in Philadelphia or in New Kensington, Pennsylvania. How did the projects affect those communities? And then finally, the investors, the folks primarily from within Penn State who put the $876,000 into these projects. So I realize this is a rather dense slide, and I'm not going to explain all of it, but what I want to show you here is that if you go across the top, it has different categories, and these were the categories that I used to once I gathered data, to create a crude and rather subjective set of measures that seemed reasonable to determine what the human, social, produced, financial, and natural capital returns were, and how to turn those into a set of metrics that could make these wildly different projects be comparable. Now, I'll say right away that it is quite messy, and it was, in a way, an experiment. But if you look across the top, you'll see what the project title was, the type, and that is more or less a sort of sustainable solutions or a solution development. That's what SD or TL, which is teaching and learning. So those were types of projects that we funded. Then the size of the award, and on this slide you can see the $555 Pride Pantry, and then an investment of about $56,000 in a community solar on state project. Now you go across, and the awards have HD, which would be human capital depth. So that was the depth of the learning or the immersion, and then HB, which would be breadth. How many people there were, and then S bond, which is social bonding capital, S bridge, which is bridging capital. Then you have produced, financial, and natural. And so then you could make a kind of gross score that would be total there. And then what we did is we did this sort of crude return on investment measure, which was just a quotient of the award size compared to the total. And I'll tell you right now that the size of the investment had absolutely no correlation whatsoever with the return on investment by this crude kind of calculation. Then we sort of put measures together to see where things were strong. So we could do a human plus social, we could do an economic, we could do an environmental, and then also like a breadth score, which would tell us, did it hit the, and a TBL score, did it hit the triple bottom line and how strongly? So I realize there's a lot behind this slide, but this was just a way for me in working through all of these different measures and gathering all this information of figuring out how we could compare very different projects. And I'll show you some of these different projects, particularly because I'd like to share with you what we found to make successful projects. So we define success as approximately meeting the project's stated goal in a timely fashion and in ways that generated multiple capital returns for multiple stakeholders. So we found six indicators of success, or these were the six characteristics, I should say, of success. And this slide will come back. So a vision of sustainability, a commitment to education, that they built on existing initiatives, that they broadened coalitions. They also had a committed champion, or in some cases champions, people who really led and drove the projects forward. And finally, that they were structured and organized. None of this, of course, is rocket science. There's nothing incredibly difficult to figure out about this. I think that many of us have been on teams, and if a team doesn't have vision, you say, well, what are we doing here? And if you're at a university and you're doing something that doesn't have an educational commitment, you might wonder, well, why are we doing this thing? So if we were to take these, and you can relate them back to how we define the living lab, and you'll see that there's really a connection between those two things. So I would encourage you to define living lab so that you're able to relate the outcomes that you want to that definition, and of course, how you would define successful projects for where you are. So I'm going to share 5 projects with you that did a really good job on each of these different characteristics. So the first is the biological controls for greenhouse pest management. And they created a program and policy for a number of Penn State greenhouses that reduced pesticide use 60 to 100% in different locations. And there on the right part of your screen, you can see Scott DiLoretto, and he's pointing out to his intern there, very likely what he calls a mummy. That is a parasitized aphid that had either a parasitic wasp or fly lay an egg on the aphid, and then its larva, sort of like the movie Alien, burst from the mummy burst from the aphid having eaten it from the inside out. What Scott did is he set up a program that worked with interns, also with courses in the College of Education, and visiting junior high and middle school and high school students to teach them about integrated pest management using bugs like mites, wasps, and flies to control pests like aphids and other mites. And it's really very cool. They were funded with about, I believe, $12,000, and that's in the notes that you guys will be able to see. And he did this because he didn't want to be exposing people in the greenhouses to pesticides. And you can watch the video and see him going around with, in a garb, and he wanted to greatly reduce that. So he understands the connection between a healthy working environment and how we treat plants. He's incredibly articulate about it. And if you watch the video, which you can see linked there, you also see that he just has an incredible amount of energy and positivity. And his interns have gone on to take management positions in greenhouses since he started this project, and are themselves now champions for integrated pest management. So the next had both educational commitment and a broadened coalition. These are the storied images Marcellus Shale. So as many of you probably know, Pennsylvania has undergone an absolute boom from the fracking industry. In 2004, Wren's Well was drilled horizontally and hydraulically fractured in Washington County, and quickly the industry expanded across Pennsylvania, creating some economic opportunity and also greatly disrupting communities. So 10 years, well, actually 11 years in 2015, in 2014, Stephen Rubin and Kat Parazak took their students out into Washington, or into Indiana and Westmoreland counties, and then north toward Tioga County, to take pictures of impacted communities, impacted forests, and more. It was a really remarkable project that was not a science project. It used the power of documentary photography to create curated galleries at Penn State at the same time that there was a major exhibition at our Palmer Museum of Art. And what happened is that in these curated photo exhibitions, people, some with no idea about fracking, some people who were really pro-fracking, and some people who absolutely hate it, came together and they had really interesting conversations because of the photographs. And the photographs, speak to sustainability in such a rich way. But ultimately, a picture may be worth 1,000 words, but each person's 1,000 words are their own. And then sharing, they were able to develop some new insights and understanding of a very contentious issue that is clearly continuing to this day. So that educational commitment was both in the classroom, they went out of the classroom into the shale fields, and then brought that educational commitment back to the community. The broadened coalition came about because in order for this project to really work well, Stephen and Kat had to work with someone who knew how to, who knew, say, the industry, where to go, and who could show them around. And so Dave Yoxtimer from the Marcellus Center for Outreach and Research was really kind of their guide. He came, he taught some classes, and opened students' minds and eyes up to, to the way that the industry had spread out. So it was a really remarkable collaboration. And when I asked all of the people I interviewed for this project, and there were 5 who I interviewed for this project, would you work with any of the other people? Again, they all said yes, which I think when we think about these living labs, you want those connections and that transdisciplinary understanding. So next is an existing initiative, and this was the Living Filter. It had been built almost 50 years ago by a faculty, Dick Parazek, who's actually Kat Parazek's father. It's interesting how these things happen. But he was in geosciences, and what the Living Filter does is it takes treated wastewater from our wastewater treatment plant and pumps it out into some ag fields and into a plot of forest a couple miles from campus. Now, what's interesting about this is that, it had been, I don't know if you could say taken for granted, but it was reasonably concluded that the Living Filter would be removing nitrates from the treated wastewater. But no one had actually tested it. So what Jake did, his name is here, Jacob Hagedorn, what he did is he took cores out in the ag fields and from the forest to see how much nitrate, what the nitrate levels were in those core samples. And he did find that they were well below any EPA limit, and not surprisingly, but with good evidence and proof that the forest cores had much less than the ag fields, which were mostly corn. He was able to carry this out in large part because of the existing initiative itself that had good infrastructure and previously existing cooperation between geosciences and our Office of Physical Plant. In fact, one day when Jake was out and some of his equipment had failed, he was able to call up the folks who managed the site, and they came out and they gave him a hand. So there was also this really nice work between people in very different parts of the university. This has a really wonderful story. These committed champions for the remote wind development group, and they won the American Wind Energy Society's competition in 2014. Brian, who is pictured there at the bottom left, was an aerospace engineering graduate student, and he said when he was interviewing for jobs, the remote wind power was one of the things that they wanted to talk about. How we performed in this competition and how I did as a supervisor for the competition. I ended up with a job at Sikorsky Aircraft, so it's a tangible benefit to me. Well, part of what had happened, it's not actually just that he won and that they won. I mean, this team was an incredible team of business students, energy, business and finance, aerospace engineering, students from across engineering, earth and mineral sciences. Including the sort of finance and management degrees. They came up with, they both designed and engineered a turbine, came up with a communications plan and a business plan for it. They flew to Las Vegas. When they landed, got to their hotel, and they opened up their cases, and lo and behold, 2 of the turbine blades were broken. These are made of, I believe, carbon fiber, and they had no way right there to replace them. So Brian immediately started looking for a 3D printing shop and found one in Valencia, California, called them, said, do you think you guys can print these? They said, send us the specs. So he sent them the files. They were able to print them in under 12 hours. And at something like 3 o'clock in the morning, already jet lagged, he got into a car, drove to Valencia, picked up the turbine blades first thing in the morning, drove back and managed to get the turbine blades onto the turbine itself for the first wind tunnel test. The first test didn't go quite as well as planned. The second one went very well, but they did go on to win the competition. And part of that is Brian, because his commitment really made that happen. Now, he's really exceptional, but I can say that he isn't a complete outlier. We had other folks who were just really driven, who wanted to make things happen in a number of our other projects, and we see that it really made a big difference. The last one is about structure and organization, people, plants, and pollinators. This was a team of graduate students who was advised by one of our College of Agriculture faculty, Dave Mortensen. But these graduate students designed a pollinator garden that would be at our Sustainability Experience Center, and they wanted to do it with all native pollinator plants. And you can see a list there on the right, and you can see the schematic there on the left. They did this as a group, all together, and really organized themselves so that they were learning about both the plants and also how to interact with facilities. They worked with the Penn State Master Gardeners who work with Extension, and created a remarkable and beautiful place. Now, had they not been structured and organized, they would have had tremendous trouble getting things done. We had other projects that did have to work with our facilities that were not nearly so organized and able to interact with facilities and physical plant, and suffered for it. So their structure and organization really ended up making a really big difference, both in how it ended up looking and in their ability to get things done in a timely fashion. Now, I can say that we also had some unsuccessful projects. These were not 32 A+. There were some projects that really didn't do very well. And so we also wanted to learn from those, and I was explicitly asked to. And if I relate these back to what made successful projects, they may have lacked a strong sustainability vision. They didn't have a strong educational commitment. It may have been overly focused, say, on one person who may have been a very committed champion, but ended up being a committed champion more or less for themselves. They didn't integrate with existing initiatives. So even though it seemed really great, they didn't have anywhere to kind of hold on to and get plugged into. Some of them had damaged coalitions, or in some cases, there were, it wasn't even a damaged coalition. We ended up with a couple of cases of kind of bad blood. And, you know, part of that can come down to personalities, but then it also can come down to a lack of understanding between different people's roles and their professional roles. Uncommitted or weakened champions. So I would say unequivocally that from our experience, having a community member be the champion of a project is probably a bad idea. We had some things occur with one project where the faculty champion on the project wasn't really the faculty champion on the project, and it fell onto a graduate student with no power and a community member, and they simply had no authority to really do much of anything, and it caused quite a few problems that required some bridge repair later. And finally, and this is obvious, lack of structure and organization. If you don't organize yourself and you don't hold yourself to a timeline or aren't held to a timeline, things will not get done. So I'd be happy to, talk about any of these during the question and answer period. But I just want to go back to this because I think it's really important. So having that vision, having the commitment to education, building on existing initiatives, broadening coalitions and keeping them strong, making sure that you have a committed champion who can do things within the structure of your university, and then having the structure and organization, making sure that the team is a good team and carrying things out as they ought to. So just as a recap, I hope that you've gotten some sense of how Penn State envisioned living laboratories for sustainability, and that I've given you a few examples of those. That in my overview of the research process and what we were looking for, how you can think about assessing them, and then hopefully a sense of, at least from our point of view, what a successful living lab for sustainability looks like. That's a picture of my son holding a turtle. I couldn't resist. So if you have any questions, I am all ears and ready to go. You can follow up with me later if you want to. My email is there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for an excellent presentation. I'm feeling really inspired by the work that you've done and pretty excited about your assessment approach. We've got a question from Chrissy in the chat box, and she asks, have there been any efforts to increase diversity and inclusivity within your program?
So let me get my a little sheet here. By that question, do you mean, does Chrissy, do you mean diversity and inclusivity in terms of like racial, ethnic, gender, and sex inclusivity?
Yeah, and then inclusivity is sort of more broad, thinking about just people of color, people from different economic demographics. Just like, we're constantly trying to reach out to a broader group of participants in the campuses of Living Lab on our campus, and we typically get a lot of the same students from environmental studies and econ, and so or have you made any efforts to sort of broaden your outreach and get more students from different backgrounds and things like that?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I can answer in a couple of ways. So this project, which has spun into all kinds of other projects, I would say that the faculty and students at Penn State are largely white. We have a very white institution. And so, for example, we have something like a 3.5% African American student population at Penn State University Park. There were students involved in these projects who were of many backgrounds, but I can't say what the demographic makeup of students who participated in the projects were. I just don't have that data. Additionally, when you look at, so I put this map up, New Kensington, Altoona, Montalto, Harrisburg, Schuylkill, Hazleton, and Erie Barron will also be overwhelmingly white. We did have, if you look at faculty who participated, we had lots of women who participated, several who were champions. We also had faculty and staff from a number of different ethnic backgrounds, India, East Asia, and then faculty who went to Africa were working with African organizations that were not white African organizations. I would say if we were to do this again, which we're looking at how we can structure this again, that the Institute would explicitly address that, given what we've learned.
Yeah, that's great. I think I just am trying to get in the habit of asking that question and keeping that in the forefront of my mind as I do my work, just in thinking of how to sort of strengthen that third leg of the sustainability stool, you know, and focus more on social justice and try to use some of these programs to, you know, assist historically disadvantaged communities and think about ways to bring in people of color and you know, economically challenged students into the program. So
sure,
it's an issue, especially, I mean, especially when you're, you know, predominantly white institution. I see that as being even more of a challenge. I mean, we have that challenge here, and we're, you know, about 50% people of color on our campus. So yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah, no, it is certainly a challenge. You know, I'll say though, if I put on a couple of my other hats, or even the hats of people I work with at the Sustainability Institute, we, in our sustainability leadership minor, and the flagship course for that, Sustainability 200, which I teach, that is a very diverse class. So so this semester, for example, I had in a class of, in the 40s, I had 3 women, 3 African American women, a young woman from Ecuador, students from the United Arab Emirates, student from India, student from not Honduras, from El Salvador, and so I'm seeing that what's changing in the way that we're doing our work, not through the Reinvention Fund, but through our work and outreach, that we are explicitly addressing things like climate justice, like environmental racism, and that really, I think, really importantly, realizes the kind of, well, we have happiness in our definition. And that's not happiness for white people and not other people. That's a human rights kind of issue. And so we are working on centering that, recognizing that we're at such a white institution. And we have programs that are doing things in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And we have a center in Pittsburgh and a center in Philadelphia. And the directors there and the students going there are themselves driving that social justice concern. And I have to say, it's really inspiring to see the students lead the directors of those centers, and then getting the feedback from them as they come out of, say, a class with me or some of our other faculty, that they're really waking all of us up to that. It's a really beautiful thing.
Great to hear.
Yeah. And we need to do it so much better.
Right.
Thanks, Peter. We have a question from Christina, and she asks, has the university committed to funding more projects, or was this a one-time event?
So so it is a one-time event, but many of the projects are still going, and we are trying to set up a new another reinvention fund or something like it. So it was initiated, and a number of these projects have gone on to end up creating other things. For example, we had a community solar on state project, which was this very cool 3-phased, intense community input and community conversation session that was facilitated by an integrative design professional with a solar researcher and some energy planners. And so what they had wanted to do was create a community solar project. Well, you know, and so you have a goal, the goal gets totally warped, but two things have come out of it and now live in other places. Our joint authority, the regional State College, Pennsylvania joint authority, the sewer authority, is about to start a 2.6 megawatt solar array with a battery large battery backup unit. They participated in that community solar on state, and they're saying, well, because we did that, we learned all this stuff, and so now we knew that we could go ahead and do it. So it's become its own thing, and so the community solar on state lives on that way. Another thing that's happened is that having done all that community work, Jeffrey Brownson, who is a solar researcher at Penn State, is working with representatives from the American Solar Energy Society, the Department of Environmental Protection, folks from the Philadelphia Navy Yard, from Penn Future, which is a nonprofit, and some others on a Department of Energy grant to fund the process that will realize at least 10% solar power for Pennsylvania's grid by 2030. So it lives on in other interesting ways. Finally, we are looking at setting up another fund because this was really, really good. I see Mike has a question.
Yeah, I'm just going to unmute Mike here. 1 second. Here he is. Oh, Mike, go ahead. I think you're unmuted. Mike?
I know Mike from listservs. I read his.
I've unmuted you, Mike. I'm not certain if what's happening. Okay, well, Mike's. Oh, are you there, Mike?
No, I was just about to say that I see another question.
Yeah, go ahead with Kathleen's question there, Peter.
Sure. So she wants to know, remind me what was the source of funding and how much for the original fund. So the original fund was $876,000. It was initially $600, but then, this is going to sound so weird, but then there was this other $276,000 lying around. But there were contributions from outreach. So Penn State has multiple, we have an outreach and extension. We have research, operations, academics. So Finance and business put in $200,000. I believe the Office of the Vice President of Research put in $200,000, and then outreach put in, I believe, also $200,000. And then there was other money available from some projects that had not been done that came about through our Institutes for Energy and the Environment. There was also some corporate money, and I would have to go back and look at my report. I believe that Pepsi had put in some money, but that was a cooperating funding for a project on waste reduction in Beaver Stadium. So it was largely internal. I don't think that we would be able to keep doing that for very long. At this scale, we would have to do some development work.
Okay, Peter, thank you for that. Looks like Mike has typed his question in. He asks, how do we balance projects that have a more complete sustainability vision with ones that might be disciplinary but directly applied to a longer vision like a sustainability plan?
Well, I think that that is a really, really good question. And I don't know that I can really answer it very effectively right now. I think that, you know, my hunch would be to say that if you could get the creation of, you know, a sustainability plan to relate to living labs so that you could get them to iterate with each other and kind of feed back on each other, you might be able to create some kind of interesting sort of living plan that could be realized. That's also probably really messy. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but it's just kind of what comes to mind and would require a lot more thought than I have right now. I'm sorry.
I also agree that it's an excellent question. We have one more question, which will be our last question for today from Malia, I believe, or sorry, from Mary Ellen. Do you see the SDGs as a way to assess and map projects?
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. So the Reinvention Fund preceded the SDGs. I would say that we could go through. I could go through the projects and create a matrix and get those to all talk to each other through those projects, so that we would be addressing some things, and you would see how some of them really span and some of them are incredibly narrowly focused. And for those of us who are interested in that, and you know, if you wanted to try to get, if you were going after external funding, for example, and you needed to talk the talk of global development, then that would be a really powerful way to represent this work.
That's great. And perhaps we can, Peter, if you'll indulge us, one more question from Kathleen, who asks, process-wise, why did they designate this portfolio under sustainability instead of other units like BP research?
So what had happened was, in the founding of the Sustainability Institute, we were placed in the provost's office. And the reason for that initially was because the Sustainability Institute is totally cross-functional, and I didn't say this before. So we have to integrate sustainability into all of the functional units of the university. That's our charge. So that includes outreach, that includes academics, that includes student life, that includes research, and that includes operations. And so that means that, like, we're not a typical research institute like our Environment and Natural Resources Institute, the Social Science Research Institute, the Institutes of Energy and the Environment. we're really cross-functional. And so they went, well, we can't put them over there in research because they're not doing that, but we can't put them in undergraduate education because they're not just doing that. So for the first few years, we were in the provost's office. We've since been moved over to the office of the vice president of research, but in some ways that's just for bookkeeping and management purposes. And we will be building our research portfolio, but we are not primarily a research institute at all.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate the presentation and all the information and your passion for this work. I'd like to remind everybody that our next call is on Thursday, January 11th, and want to wish you all a very happy holiday season. And this webinar has been recorded, so we'll put it on the Campuses Lab Google Drive for your reference, and want to really thank Peter for his willingness to answer any other questions that people have. If there's any last minute items, feel free to put a note in the chat box. Otherwise, thank you so much for your attendance, and Peter, thanks again.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Wonderful.